Who are you? And where are you going? What do you want?
Hello and welcome to Jiggers Place. So I'm laughing because it's always the struggle to change the image without you seeing my fingers. I still haven't quite figured out how to do that, but maybe one day. Anyway, thanks for joining me this afternoon or evening if you're on the East Coast. I'm Kevin Bemmel, your host, and here at Jiggers' Place, we relax as we head into the end of the week. We have a cocktail or two, and today we're going to be talking about an absolutely outstanding book, The Red Badge of Courage by Stephen Crane. So it was a revolutionary novel in its day. It really stands as a trendsetter in American literature. And in honor of our discussion of The Red Badge of Courage, I'm going to make a cocktail that my cocktail designing assistant, ChatGPT, and I made up, called the Red Badge. Now, for those of you who are familiar with cocktail culture, you may recognize this is kind of a play on a classic cocktail called a Manhattan. A Manhattan is usually made with Scotch and sweet vermouth. We're going to make this with bourbon. Bourbon is much more of an American liquor, and the recipe recommends a high-rye a high-rye bourbon. What that means is, so in order for something to be bourbon, it has to be made with at least 51% corn mash, okay, which is why bourbon tends to have a sweetness to it, because corn is sweet. That's why corn syrup is used to sweeten things like soft drinks. So this is a bullet bourbon, and it even says here, made using our family's high-rye mash bill and pure Kentucky limestone filtered water. So this is just a workhorse of a bourbon, so the reason, so rye, as opposed to corn, which is sweet, rye tends to be spicy in the sense of not hot, but in the sense of it brings out flavors like cinnamon and clove and those kind of things. Rye is my favorite whiskey. And just as a note here, I'm sorry, I take that back. I have it in the library. In the library, I have a decanter of rye whiskey, and it's Bullet Rye, my favorite just everyday rye whiskey. So then, the other ingredients are, we're going to use Luxardo Bitter Rosso. You can see it's got a lovely red color. And then we're going to use herring cherry liqueur, okay, and a little bit of sweet vermouth, which is also red, and a couple of dashes of good old Angostura bitters. So I've got my mixing glass with ice in it, and we're going to start out with 2 ounces of bourbon. Okay, there we go. Now, some cocktail mixers, they're really, really careful about exact measurements. I am not. Okay. It's I like mixing cocktails, but it's just, you got to kind of do your own thing. Okay, that's right. There we go. And then 3/4 of an ounce of the Luxardo Bitter Rosso. Okay, which is what's going to distinguish it from a Manhattan, that there's bitters in it. Okay, and then let's see, a 1/2 ounce of herring cherry. This is a classic cherry liqueur. One of the best, also happens to be kosher. And a Barspoon of vermouth, okay, which means just a little bit of vermouth, sweet vermouth. Okay, Barspoon in there anyway because we're going to be stirring it in a moment. Okay, and we're going to put in a couple of dashes of Angostura bitters. 1, 2. Okay. And now we're going to stir. And as I always mention when we make cocktails, the purpose of the stirring is not just to mix the ingredients, but it's also to melt some of the ice because the water brings out the flavors. Okay. So we want to mix for a good 20 to 30 seconds. And if you saw the show 2 weeks ago, I had a shaker. I managed to I forgot to put the cap on the shaker, I think, or it came off, and I had cocktail all over the place, but we got through it. So a little bit more. You can see this, if you can see, this has kind of a sangre color, sangre being blood, which of course is appropriate. The red badge of courage refers to the blood of the Civil War. Okay, that looks pretty good. We'll get our strainer out. Oh, you know what? I forgot to get a glass. And we want a coupe. So get a coupe, and we're going to pour this in. And then we're going to garnish it with an orange peel, kind of express a little bit of the there, and then drop it in. Okay, and here we go. Now, you know, I'll tell you, I'm not a big Manhattan fan, and so if you're not a big Manhattan fan, try this. This is, I like this much better than a Manhattan. Okay, I'll see you over on the sofa. So here we are. It's Thursday afternoon here in Los Angeles, a little after 5 o'clock. And as we move across the country, right, time zone, 6, 7, 8 p.m. on the East Coast, we've got our cocktail. So I don't know about you, but these long summer days, if you're doing stuff outside, they're great. But otherwise, I feel like I need to still be working as long as it's daylight out, which these days it's daylight out until 8 o'clock. And, you know, so, but that's the way it is. So this is the copy of the Red Badge of Courage that I have. This was published by Barnes and Noble. They did a whole series of classic books of classic literature, and they all have a similar format on the cover. You can see it's a short book, so less than 200 pages, as I recall. Yes, it's 183 pages, and you can see it's a large type. So the book is it's really more of a novella than a novel. A novella being kind of a short novel. And I read it decades ago now. It is a wonderful book, and not just for boys, although certainly for me as a teenager, which was when I read it, it was a lot different than reading it as an adult. The adventure of it, the pathos of it, resonated with me, I think, much more as a teen, whereas the depth of the story and the ideas that it brings forth, much more powerful as an adult. So before I talk about the book itself, I want to talk a little bit about its author, Stephen Crane. So I have a kind of a short biography of Stephen Crane.
He was born in 1871, so it was already 6 years after the Civil War had ended in 1865. And he was born in Newark, New Jersey. He was, get this, the 14th child of a Methodist minister. Wow. Big family, right? He was an American novelist, short story writer, and journalist. He attended Lafayette College and Syracuse University, but he left before graduating from Syracuse to pursue journalism in New York City, where he lived in poverty while he developed his craft of writing. Remarkably, he wrote The Red Badge of Courage when he was 24. Okay, so it was written in 1895. Okay, and he had never experienced combat himself. So I'm sure he had talked to Civil War veterans, heard their stories, that sort of thing. And as a reporter, though, he did not have firsthand experience, but when you read the book, you will see what an outstanding ability Stephen Crane had to take what he was told and turn into an extraordinarily compelling story. And he was associated with the naturalist and the realist movements in American literature, which I'll talk about in a minute. And sadly, he died when he was just 28 years old in 1900. So he died a very young man. He died of tuberculosis, which was not particularly uncommon in the 19th century. And despite that, he published several major works. I'm going to give you the names of some of them. So his first novel was called Maggie, A Girl of the Streets. It was published in 1893, and it talked about the life of a young woman in New York slums. It was initially self-published. It was one of the first American novels to realistically portray poverty and prostitution. Then, of course, he wrote The Red Badge of Courage in 1895. In 1897, he wrote what is usually considered his best short story, The Open Boat, based on his own experience surviving a shipwreck. In 1898, he wrote The Blue Hotel, also a short story. It examined violence and paranoia in the American West. And it's noted for its psychological depth and moral ambiguity, something that kind of presaged the sort of film noir phenomenon that began, arguably in the 1940s. He wrote quite a bit of war poetry. He was quite innovative in free verse, following in the footsteps of Walt Whitman. He wrote The Black Riders in 1895, which was a stark, symbolic poem that was kind of a bridge between the more lyrical style of Walt Whitman and the more contemporary modernist poetry. And then, of course, as I mentioned, he was a journalist. He covered conflicts including the Greco-Turkish War and the Spanish-American War. So Stephen Crane is associated with two literary movements. The first one being realism, which emerged in the mid-19th century. And it was really a reaction to the sort of romantic idealism that was prevalent in literature. So realist writers, as the name implies, sought to depict life as it actually was. Okay, so it didn't gloss over or paint it didn't paint a Pollyannish view of life. Rather, it was stark, trying to convey to people, what was really going on for other people, especially other classes of people with whom they would not have been familiar. So He focused on ordinary people. The realist movement, I should say, focused on ordinary people rather than the sort of historic situations. And it emphasized being accurate in observing social conditions, psychological complexity, and authentic dialogue. And there were a number of major American realists, including two of my favorite authors, William Dean Howells and Henry James. And I'm currently reading Portrait of a Lady by Henry James, a wonderful book about a young woman born in America, ends up inheriting money from her father, from her uncle, I believe it is actually her uncle, who was American but an expatriate living in England. So Stephen Crane was part of the realist movement. He was also part of the naturalism movement, which was really kind of an extension of realism that developed in the latter part of the 19th century. And it was influenced by the scientific thinking and theories of, among others, Darwin. So naturalistic writers viewed humans as sort of a subject to natural forces, heredity, environment, often portraying them as victims of circumstances beyond their control. So unlike perhaps a more sort of God-centered way of presenting life, or a deterministic way of presenting life, where people are the determiners of their own existence, or in the former that God controls the world, and so everything happens by a plan, but we're not really the sort of playthings of nature. The naturalism movement is much more of the idea that natural forces that are beyond human control, they have a big impact on human lives, and humans are essentially powerless to control or counteract these natural forces. So they employed scientific observation methods, very much in line with Charles Darwin, who of course is famous for the theory of evolution. Okay, and they often focused on kind of the darker aspects of human existence. So key figures in the naturalistic movement include Émile Zola in France. I honestly have not read any of Zola's work, and Theodore Dreiser in America. And again, I haven't read any of Dreiser's works either. To be honest, I'm not a big fan of books on the dark side. I think Kafka wasn't a naturalist, but he does kind of focus on the dark side of life, but in a way that is more sort of almost science fictionist with a twist. That's about as dark as I can go. Although one day I will have to pick up Zola and Dreiser and read them. So Stephen Crane really kind of occupied a unique position between these two movements. He was part of what drove the shift from one to another and beyond, and he had a tremendous impact on American literature. So I'm going to talk about some of those impacts, and those are really going to be the basis for why I think it's important for you to read The Red Badge of Courage. But I have to fortify myself here for a moment. Okay, so first of all, Crane really pioneered the sort of psychological realism that became a hallmark of early to mid 20th century literature. So he really looked at the sort of internal psychological processes, particularly when a character was under stress. And his idea was to reveal the the character of a character by, sort of stream of consciousness, expression, and a sort of an inner monologue that the character was having. So writers who were influenced by this aspect of Crane include Ernest Hemingway, whose writing is, to my mind, brilliant, whether it's The Old Man and the Sea or For Whom the Bell Tolls, The Sun Also Rises. These are all wonderful, wonderful books. Let's see, I think it's For Whom the Bell Tolls I believe is his book that's set during the Spanish Civil War. So you can see that both were writing on war themes. And William Faulkner, who of course is also brilliant, As I Lay Dying being one of his best known novels. So this sort of psychological realism is something that Stephen Crane pioneered. He also developed the idea of impressionistic prose, where he revealed information through the sensory impressions and the subjective experiences of his characters, rather than sort of traditional narrative exposition, where the author kind of tells you what someone may be feeling, or explains to you the inner struggle that a character may be going through. Impressionistic prose, really, you learn about those internal aspects of a character through how they talk and how they express themselves. Okay, so you're getting an impression of the character from the character himself, rather than through the sort of omniscient author who stands apart from the characters in the book. Crane also kind of established the template for modern war literature. So he emphasized the psychological over the historic aspects of war, and again, he influenced Hemingway in his war novels, as well as Norman Mailer's The Naked and the Dead and Tim O'Brien's Vietnam War stories. So whereas if you look at War and Peace, which is this Leo Tolstoy's grandiose not tome too, but explanation of war, and as this historic, heroic thing. Well, actually, that's probably not so much the case, but more along the line. Patrick O'Brian, for example, in many of his books, whether it's the coming up on it, Master and Commander, the famous sea novels, very heroic characters. Same with the Horatio Hornblower books by Foster. This is portraying war in a heroic way. So Stephen Crane was more. He really wanted to depict war and its impact on the soldiers, the people who fought, and the kind of psychological impact and typically not positive impact it had on the characters. Okay. He also his books sort of pioneered urban realism, kind of in sort of the vein of Charles Dickens, who so many of his novels were designed to bring to light the challenges of the urban poor in London, whether it's Oliver Twist or Little Dorrit. So many of Charles Dickens's books were designed to move the middle and upper classes to understand the struggles of the lower class. And he did so in a very realistic way. Okay, and there are other aspects, but those are sort of, you know, some of the main ones. So another little sip. The fact of the matter is that despite dying at a very young age, 28 years old, Stephen Crane was really at a significant pivot point in American literature. And I'm not going to go so far as to say American literature wouldn't be today what it is without Stephen Crane, but his books, and The Red Badge of Courage is far and away his most well-known book, had it's pretty difficult to understate the impact that it had on how American literature developed. So why should you read The Red Badge of Courage, right? This is where we're going to talk tachlis here, as we say in Yiddish, where the rubber hits the road, right? So I came up with 8 reasons why you should read The Red Badge of Courage. Okay, and then I'll add on a 9th. First of all, it is a Revolutionary War narrative, not a revolutionary in the sense of the American Revolution. Revolutionary in the way that it changed how war was depicted in literature. So I mentioned that already. It was one of the first novels to depict war from a psychological rather than a historic perspective, and it showed the internal struggle that a soldier grappling with fear and moral conflict dealt with, rather than glorifying battle. Okay, and I was having this conversation with a friend of mine earlier today, and we were talking about how war has changed over the centuries, and how in many ways fighting in a war was a rite of passage for young men. And until relatively, you know, recent times, you know, armies, like they lined up, you know, in front of each other, and they shot arrows at each other, or they fired muskets and rifles at each other, and you're standing there kind of on a field, not so far away from the enemy. And to do that really took a lot of intestinal fortitude, right? And then, you know, obviously through wars like the French and Indian War, the American Revolution, and then on into the, you know, and then on through the rest of the 19th century and into, you know, the development of modern war during the Boer War, the Spanish-American War, and on into World War I, World War II. Obviously, that changed. That completely changed. So, so too did the way novelists dealt with war, and it went from being this sort of heroic rite of passage of manhood to an examination of what a soldier has to go through to be a part of a war. So. So that's one reason you should read it. So you can understand the nature of this most destructive of human conflicts. That's number one. Number two, Crane really was using pioneering literary techniques. I talked about his realism, his naturalism. So these really, Crane was really a part of the development of American literature. And you would be hard pressed to understand how American literature changed from the 19th to the 20th century without reading The Red Badge of Courage and getting an actual sense of what these literary movements were all about. So that's number two. Number three, it is a timeless exploration of courage. So the novel, or novella really, it examines what courage truly is. So often we associate courage, especially in fiction, with sort of a reckless sense of bravery. Certainly, when you look at Sir Walter Scott, whether it's Ivanhoe or his other wonderful novels, look, they're absolutely delightful to read. But there's a certain recklessness in the chivalric descriptions of courage that you see. And Crane was really dealing with the kind of inner bravery somebody needs to have to do something that means they have to overcome their fear. So it's a much deeper psychological examination of courage. And for those of you who have ever gotten an email from me, you see that I sign my emails courage at all times. And the reason I sign my emails that way is it is extremely difficult to be courageous. It's actually easier, I think, to be physically brave than it is to be morally courageous. And so I think we all need just that reminder that, we need to exhibit courage. We need to exhibit the ability to cleave to our moral code. Okay. Next, the red badge of courage is just a masterful example of psychological realism, the kind of inner dialogues that Crane's portrayal of Henry, who's the main character in the book, that he deals with, the self-doubt, the rationalizations. I think you're going to find that they feel very relevant and contemporary, because Crane was writing about the human condition. So the fact that he wrote the book now almost 100, over 150 years ago. No, I'm sorry, 1895. So 130 years ago. It still has a very modern feel to it. And this is important because I think one of the reasons for reading literature is to help us build our sense of humility. Okay. It's easy to think that because we have at our command such tremendous technology, relatively speaking, at least, nationwide, tremendous amount of wealth, that somehow we are the sort of titans of all time. And that is not the case. There's an argument to be made that in some ways we are diminished from our forebears. And so to keep our sense of humility about us is very important. And literature can help us do that when we see the timelessness of it. Okay, next is even though it's a novella, it's short. Like I said, this printing of it is less than 200 pages with large type. So, and yet it is enormously impactful. So, whereas I mentioned Leo Tolstoy's book, War and Peace, it's like over 1,000 pages long, right? Arguably, Stephen Crane packs into less than 200 pages as much impact as it took Tolstoy 1,000 pages to make. And I think we underestimate the power, of brevity. And so the red badge of courage will help us remember that. Next is the historical significance of the book. So although it's fiction, it has a sense of nonfiction in the way it talks about the Civil War. So I just need to wet my whistle. So the Civil War was really the most brutal war that America ever fought. It was literally, in some cases, brother against brother. And And so to read The Red Badge of Courage is to understand the Civil War in a different way than if you read, for example, The Battle Cry of Freedom, which is a wonderful nonfiction history of the Civil War. Hey, history is fantastic. Don't get me wrong. I love history. I love reading about history. But history does not help us necessarily understand how individuals who actually experienced events felt. And this is the power of literature, and especially a book like The Red Badge of Courage. It helps us create an empathetic connection between our forebears going through. It can be a monumentally cataclysmic event like the Civil War. It can be the interpersonal upheaval of the breakup of a relationship. Okay. And so that's a reason to read literature in general, but The Red Badge of Courage specifically. Okay, and then two more. So just to understand the influence on American literature that Stephen Crane had. So if you've read any of the Leatherstocking Tales, I'm going up on the author's name, Daniel Defoe, who wrote in the late 18th century. They're wonderful, wonderful books. Nathaniel Hawthorne, The Scarlet Letter, again, a wonderful book, but very, very different than Hemingway and Faulkner, who wrote in the first half of the 20th century. So Stephen Crane helps you understand the transition from Defoe and Hawthorne to Hemingway and Faulkner. Okay, so, and it's good to understand how that developed. Okay, and then the last of my 8 reasons why you should read The Red Badge of Courage is it is a universal coming of age story. So setting aside the war setting and all of the internal conflict over bravery versus cowardice and attempts to cleave to one's moral code, the main character, Henry, in The Red Badge of Courage, he is a young man. And it is through his experiences that are written about in The Red Badge of Courage that he becomes a man. I mean, that's the coming of age story. That is The Red Badge of Courage. And these are useful for us. They're useful for us as adults to interpret how we matured. They're useful for teenagers. This is not a book, by the way, for preteens, I would argue, but for teenagers, high school age, it's valuable for them to understand the process of coming of age. Okay, and from that standpoint, in our society today, the impetuses for someone to mature and take on adult responsibilities, I think, have never been lower. So, we try to delay adulthood for our children. We go to great lengths to do that. And while some of that is good, other parts of it are not, especially if it permanently retards their ability to mature and be able to take on life on its own terms. And so to read coming of age stories and see how previous generations thought about this process is valuable for both teens, young adults, and old adults like me. So I promised you a bonus 9th reason why you should read The Red Badge of Courage, and that is because it is just a great story. So if you like reading great stories, you're not going to find a better one than The Red Badge of Courage. And so there you go, a bonus reason to read the book. So my cocktail is done. My case is presented. I submit it to you, the jury. And it only remains for me to thank you for joining me. And if you have any thoughts, all the links will be in the show notes when this episode posts on YouTube. If you enjoy the show, do me a favor and suggest it to a friend or family member. I'd really appreciate it. And if they get something out of it, that this show in particular is just an opportunity for us to really talk about what matters in life. Not that finances aren't important, obviously they are, but relationships and personal growth are really the raison d'être, as the French say, the reason for being of human existence. And so that's why I do this show. Plus, I get to have a cocktail. So thank you so much for joining me here at Jiggers' Place. I wish you a wonderful rest of the week and a restorative weekend. And signing off as I always do. Marie, darling, you are my belle. Courage at all times, my friends.